Before and after photos. Famous Stoic philosophers such as Marcus Aurelius teach that one should guard their ears and eyes from bad influences. And while raunchy TV shows or explicit music may be avoidable, the horrors of war are inescapable for soldiers participating in them. War disfigures and destroys the bodies of soldiers. During the course of a campaign, soldiers are exposed to explosions, chemicals, and gunfire. Regardless if these things actually injure the soldier, they have to wake up every day and see the destruction of war around them. Many men see their friends die, entire villages burned to the ground, and other horrific scenes. All these images can leave a lasting impression on their face. This is because stress can also physically impact the body, and the effects of stress are abundant during wartime. Here are a few photographs that highlight how soldiers' faces changed before and after seeing action in war. American Civil War. Sometimes the effects of war are solemn and glaringly obvious. While some soldiers may return home with severe mental trauma and stress disorders, others have to confront the reality that parts of their body never left the battlefield. Disfiguring wounds and amputations were commonplace during the American Civil War, leaving many soldiers depressed and with a constant reminder of the horror they had witnessed. Pictured in the first photograph is an unnamed soldier in 1860, roughly 1 year before the outbreak of the war. Prior to the First Battle of Bull Run, many young men were excited to go to war and sought glory and recognition on the battlefield. Tales of heroic struggles and valor permeated the hearts of the youth, and many were convinced that the war would be a short, victorious endeavor. However, as shown in the second photograph, which was taken just 1 year later in 1861, the war would prove to be more destructive and costlier than previously thought. This is a photograph of 17-year-old William Sargent, who lost both his arms during the American Civil War. Only a teenager, the soberness and heavy eyes of Sargent stare back at the camera with a maturity and seriousness unbecoming of someone so young. It is startling to think of how quickly this young man's fortunes turned on him, as the war wasn't even at the conclusion of its first year. And yet, here he is, a young soldier, disfigured and without arms, looking into a camera over 150 years ago. World War I. Thanks to the Imperial War Museum's Lives of the First World War and the UK Photo and Social History Archive, we have access to photos of many soldiers from the First World War. In this photograph, Major Leslie Cheap is pictured sometime before deploying with the 1st King's Dragoon Guards at the beginning of the war. The picture is dated before 1916, and we can infer from Cheap's dress and expression that he has graduated from the Worcestershire Yeomanry. Aged no older than in his early 20s, Cheap appears as a friendly, familiar face in the picture. His eyes are optimistic and hopeful, perhaps even glad at his accomplishments thus far into his career. No one could have guessed the peril that he and many other young men would face when they left home. World War I, also known as the Great War, was the introduction of industry on the battlefield. Crude tanks, basic biplanes, and early experiments into chemical warfare all made their debut on the battlefields of the Somme, Ypres, and Tannenberg. Cheap's glowing expression was going into a meat grinder of endless decay and ruin. Pictured in the second photograph is Sir Bart Hickman, who was a lieutenant in the 4th Dragoon Guards. This photograph was taken after his release from a prisoner of war camp and shows the effects of his 3-year stay at the camp. Hickman's hair is thin, and his eyes wander off behind the camera. British prisoners of war were often tasked with hard manual labor and had to be able to work outside all day, digging canals or clearing fields for their captors. A life of manual labor shows on a man's face, but couple manual labor with the terrifying elements of war, and men's spirits begin to crumble. Many men returned after the war as shells of their former selves, forever haunted by the atrocities they witnessed. Abraham Lincoln. As the United States endured the Civil War, The physical toll on President Abraham Lincoln was documented in photographs. These images reveal how his face aged during the tumultuous period. Between 1859 and 1865, Lincoln grappled with how to eradicate slavery, the death of his 11-year-old son Willie, and the increasing bloodshed of the Civil War. The physical transformation of his face, from youthful to careworn, reflects the heavy burden of his office. In 1859, Lincoln posed for a photograph in a Chicago gallery. His wife thought it was the best likeness of him she had ever seen. Soon after winning the Republican presidential nomination, he sat for several photographs by Alexander Hessler with a beardless face. However, by the time of his famous Matthew Brady photograph in 1861, Lincoln had grown a beard and cast a pensive look into the camera. 1 month earlier, Southern rebels had bombarded Fort Sumter, launching the American Civil War. At the Battle of Antietam, nearly 18 months into the war, Union troops remarked on the president's appearance, noting the deep sadness on his face and the burden on his heart. That same day, Lincoln posed for Alexander Gardner in a series of photographs with his commanders. By the time of his 1865 portrait by Francis B. Carpenter, Lincoln had grown heavier and more deeply lined, with heavy bags under his eyes. The physical transformation of his face reflected the tremendous mental and emotional toll of his office. Lincoln's death only weeks later was a tragic end to a life of immense struggle and sacrifice. Dwight D Eisenhower. Dwight D Eisenhower was an incredibly influential military commander and politician who served as the 34th President of the United States. But before he was elected president, he had an extensive military career that earned him a reputation as a brilliant strategist and leader. He served as a general during World War II, and his accomplishments helped the Allies achieve victory and end the war. While his successes in the war were immense, the stress of war deeply impacted Eisenhower, transforming him physically and changing his outlook on life. He was responsible for the lives of millions of servicemen and women, and the success of the war effort relied on his decisions. He was tasked with the immense responsibility of leading a successful Allied invasion of Europe, and he spent hours poring over maps and battle plans to ensure that everything went as planned. Pictured here in 1942, Eisenhower had just accepted his position as Lieutenant General and sole commander of the European Theater of Operations. At his desk, he looks confident and optimistic about the challenges ahead. The photo looks almost spontaneous as he appears to be talking to the photographer, and his desk is littered with paperwork. No doubt at this time, much of Eisenhower's work consisted of planning and solving logistical problems. The following picture shows Eisenhower roughly 2 years after the war. The stress of war changed Eisenhower's outlook on life. He realized the tremendous cost of war and was determined to ensure that such a conflict never happened again. He created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, to help prevent future wars, and worked for nuclear disarmament and international cooperation. His experiences in war had taught him the importance of peace and diplomacy, which became a cornerstone of his later political career. Here, he looks worn out and slightly disenfranchised after defeating Germany. As the man who organized and planned D-Day, Eisenhower was responsible for many men's lives and certainly knew that many of the soldiers he was commanding would die. This had a profound impact on him, and although the war had immense physical and emotional tolls, it also changed Eisenhower's approach to leadership and his outlook on life. He became a more compassionate leader and worked to ensure peace and cooperation prevailed in the post-war world. Through his efforts, the modern world has a lot to thank him for and owes him remembrance as someone who fought for peace. The effects of war on the human face are undeniable. While some of these effects can be physical, such as burns and scars, many of them are psychological. Stress can cause changes in facial expressions, skin and hair color, and even the eyes. The faces of soldiers before and after experiencing war are often drastically different, a testament to the lasting impacts of conflict. It is a constant reminder of the need for peace and the psychological and physical trauma of war on the human face.